All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the fourth part of our Overcoming Digital Divide series, a six-part workshop series presented as a partnership with the Ryerson Leadership Lab, the Brookfield Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, the First Nations Technology Council, and Simon Fraser University's Public Square, and supported by our title sponsor, TELUS. I'm Sam Andre, the Director of Policy and Research at the Ryerson Leadership Lab, and we're thrilled you're able to join us today. Before we begin, I want to take a moment just to recognize who's not able to gather with us today. Frontline workers, healthcare providers, caregivers, people with low incomes, and all those who this conversation is intended to serve, those who remain disconnected from quality, safe, reliable internet. To try and help address those gaps, we will be making a recording available of this with a transcript and a summary of the major takeaways from today's conversation. I also want to point out the accessibility features for our virtual conversation today. You can access a live transcript of the session in a separate window. In the top left corner of your Zoom screen, you'll see a red button that says live. You can click on that and it will be given the option to view the transcript. If you are prompted to make an account, you can just click X. That's not required to see the transcript. There's also live ASL interpretation that you should see on the screen now. And also, I'd like to give a land acknowledgement today that's reflective of where Ryerson University sits. We do this as a symbolic restorative act, one among many to follow and part of a wider, ongoing, and hopefully transformative reconciliation project at Ryerson. Toronto's on the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. It's covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, Treaty 13, and the Williams Treaties. We're committed to honoring our obligations to these nations, treaties, and to justice for Indigenous peoples more generally. And through this workshop series, we hope to do that by amplifying Indigenous voices and also ensuring we're making space to consider the unique realities and digital divides faced by Indigenous peoples in Canada. So we're excited to continue this series with a discussion today on the digital challenges faced by people with disabilities. There's more than 6 million people over the age of 15 living with a disability in Canada. And in 2018, about 20% of people with disabilities didn't use the internet compared to just 10% overall. And especially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and the move toward online delivery of critical government services and remote work and learning, access to the internet and digital services has never been more important. So we hope to shine a light on these issues and also potential solutions. And we think it's especially timely as tomorrow is Global Accessibility Awareness Day, and hope that this conversation can help advance some solutions. So now I'm excited to speak more about some of the work ahead, to introduce our first guest, the Honourable Joyce Murray, Canada's Minister of Digital Government. In this role, Minister Murray is responsible for the federal government's IT services and digital strategies. Minister Murray was first elected as a member of Parliament for Vancouver Quadra in 2008. She also served in the BC government's cabinet. And since the beginning of the pandemic, the minister has been working to ensure government services are accessible, reliable, and easy to use. Thanks so much for being here with us, Minister Murray.
I'm really happy to be with you. And so I appreciate this opportunity to be part of this very timely event today, Sam. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from my home in Vancouver on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Discussions like these are really vital to finding solutions because as digital technology advances at breakneck speed, ensuring equality of digital access is of course critical to ensuring that everyone in Canada has a fair chance at success. And so for most of us, when we've heard the term digital divide, we've thought of broadband access and the rural-urban divide, which ironically, I did work on as a provincial minister about 17 years ago to bridge the digital divide. And of course, basic connectivity is the starting point. And we have a very vast and diverse country, so Canada faces challenges that smaller, more densely populated countries don't have. But the federal government is really investing an enormous amount in closing this gap, billions so far, and most recently in budget 2021, there will be an additional $1 billion over 6 years to support access to high-speed internet for Canadians in rural and remote areas and to make internet more affordable. But as your workshop series points out, the digital divide isn't just about access to broadband. It is a nuanced, complex issue. And the more we study this challenge, the more we uncover the digital challenges that people face every day and why. Beyond the specifics, we know that overcoming this digital divide and removing these barriers will make a real difference in the lives of Canadians so that they can participate equally in society and in the economy. So digital technology has the potential to bring many more people who face barriers into the workforce than ever before, and our government's committed to meeting their needs when it comes to designing solutions. Our government actually created a 5-year program to invest in hardware and software solutions that help Canadians with disabilities to fully participate in the workplace. This is called the Accessible Technology Program, which co-funds innovative projects to develop innovative, assistive, and adaptive digital devices and technologies for persons with disabilities. And that program recently funded Technologies Humanware Inc., which developed a low-cost Braille cell technology and Braille readers that allow visually impaired persons to immediately access digital content in different formats. Another example is Assistive Inc., which developed a software that enables users to control their computers using head movements and a standard webcam without the need to wear any equipment or marker on the face. So our government has also made it a requirement for federally regulated organizations to identify, remove, and prevent barriers in information and communications technology under the Accessible Canada Act, which came into force in 2019. Clearly, we are committed to building inclusion into everything we do. And in my ministry agency called Shared Services Canada has an accessibility, accommodation, and adaptive computer technology program, or AAACT, which helps government departments design, procure, and test on enterprise-wide solutions, information and communication technologies, and services that meet digital accessibility requirements. So AAACT also provides adaptive solutions and workplace accommodations for public service employees with disabilities or injuries. And again, there's yet another digital divide that I would like to talk a bit about today, and that's the divide between the ease and simplicity of digital service offerings from the private sector versus the public sector, and specifically the Government of Canada. And it's no secret that when it comes to digital service delivery, the Government of Canada has a bit of work to do. People depend on digital tools to shop, communicate, learn, and connect virtually, which has increased exponentially during the COVID-19 pandemic. But there's a divide between that experience people have and our government's ability to serve people in the same ways in some cases, which is why improving access to digital government services and ensuring that they're inclusive for all Canadians. I'm going to emphasize that several times in my remarks because it is a huge theme for me personally. Improving access is the driving force behind my work as Canada's first dedicated Minister of Digital Government. My mandate to lead the federal government's digital transformation requires system-wide change so that we can consistently serve Canadians in the ways they need and expect today. We have to ensure our services and transactions are designed in ways that are accessible to Canadians of all abilities at all levels of digital literacy from any device. Now, I do want to say that when the pandemic hit over a year ago, access to digital services became even more critical. And inside the government, we quickly pivoted to remote work and service delivery, which meant we also had to quickly roll out brand new benefits and supports for Canadians and businesses, support that in many cases was accessed digitally by necessity. And our digital teams had to really lift up and accelerate their transformation efforts almost overnight to equip the hundreds of thousands of public servants who were working now from home so that they could provide Canadians with service and critical support. We had to quickly build tools that would be accessible by all and communicate with Canadians in more inclusive ways about COVID-19 and the government supports that were available to them at that time of critical need. Canada.ca itself follows the Government of Canada's standard on web accessibility, which means that the web content meets or exceeds international standard, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0. And that means that images and pages can be described by screen readers, content can be tabbed through for users who can't use a mouse. And even the colors we use have a defined level of color contrast so that people with color blindness or low vision can discern them. Our government's response to the challenges faced this year proved we can rise to the challenge in an emergency. So my job now is to seize this momentum and push the Government of Canada to make this level of service delivery the norm. To guide our work, I've collaborated with the digital government teams for the last year to develop a strategy that will create lasting change in the government. And we've identified our biggest challenges and broken the work into 4 areas. Firstly is modernizing the way we replace, build, and manage major IT systems. And this includes addressing accessibility in our government-wide systems, our workplace devices, and our adaptive technologies. An updated network will use the latest security measures to protect personal information, connect seamlessly to cloud and enterprise data centers, and move at a speed and scale that people expect today. And as you can imagine, there's an enormous amount of legacy infrastructure and network and systems that will require attention to make this transformation. But our second area of focus is providing user-friendly digital service to people when and where they need them. And we know that right now it can be a challenge for Canadians and businesses to actually find and use some government services, regardless of their ability or digital literacy. Federal systems and process don't operate seamlessly together. It's not part of how they were developed. And that means that Canadians have to interact with each department separately and provide personal information separately each time we apply for something, be it EI, a passport, or CPP. So we are developing a digital ID called Sign in Canada to make it easier for everyone to securely access these services while ensuring that they're accessible to everyone who needs them. And we'll do that by building in accessibility from the start, designing and delivering for everyone. We do that by designing with the people that use our services based on our digital standards, which is a set of guiding principles for improvement. We need to engage users with distinct needs, and we're doing just that. People with different levels of digital literacy. And we do that from the outset to better understand and identify the barriers they face and help us push a government-wide shift, as I've been describing, and one that puts people's needs first instead of prioritizing government processes. So the third area of work is to take a coordinated approach to digital operations across the Government of Canada. And that doesn't mean a monolithic approach. It means a modular approach, but coordinated. So traditionally, departments functioned as standalone organizations guided by their specific mandates and hierarchical reporting structures, a system that was designed for the analog age. What's more, in the past, each department has developed its very own IT infrastructure, leading to a myriad of different systems that may not be able to talk to each other and may pose security challenges as well. So these are major barriers to providing Canadians with the kind of seamless services that they expect from their government. In response, we've developed a digital operations strategic plan to ensure we take a government-wide approach to data stewardship, to IT systems, and so that we can deliver secure and reliable services. And to complement the plan, the accessibility strategy for the public service sets the direction to make information and communications technology usable by each and everyone. And we are providing public servants with the modern standardized platforms and accessible tools that they need to collaborate across departments, all with the objective of serving Canadians better. So all of this isn't just an IT challenge or an organizational challenge, it's also a culture challenge. And recognizing that is why the fourth and final area of focus for me and the ministry is transforming how we work as a government. And that means tackling longstanding institutional barriers to digital innovation and inclusive design, barriers that include processes, governance systems, procurement practices, as well as lack of modern up-to-date digital skills. Because I see accessibility as everyone's responsibility, I know we need a diversity of views, experiences, and backgrounds to get the best solutions. And that's why the Government of Canada is committed to hiring 5,000 persons with disabilities by 2025. We're bringing together multidisciplinary teams that reflect the diversity of Canadian society and building a culture where digital is a mindset, where we work in the open and we collaborate widely with other sectors and levels of government. And the ultimate goal is to transform Canadians' experience of their transactions with the Government of Canada. There's a lot of work ahead, but I've seen that our public service is capable of doing amazing work. And it's so important to be creating those links and bridges with organizations like yours and the others that are part of the panel and part of the organization of today's event. So it is a big hill to climb, but our pandemic response has shown that secure, reliable, and easy to access services are possible in a crisis. So we're working towards the goal that will continue across the Government of Canada, and we will ensure that these services are designed at the outset for everyone. So thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Really helpful context setting for us, and we're excited now to sort of dig into those challenges more and what more needs to be done with our great panel. So thank you for being here. And
my pleasure, and I look forward to listening in for a while longer.
Perfect. Thanks so much. So for everyone at home, we'll be moving now to the panel, and we welcome your questions anytime through the chat. We also are using Jamboards, and we're putting a link in the chat now to those, and they give you an opportunity to provide your own input to the guiding questions that are in our framing paper and that we are using with our panelists today. And so you just can click on the Jamboard link to add a comment, use the sticky note tab on the left-hand side of the screen, and one of our team members will be helping to organize them as they come in. We'll be reflecting on them as we go. So thanks to all of our panelists for being here. We're going to give you a few minutes just to give some opening remarks and your overall take on the digital divide for people with disabilities. And we're going to start with Heather. So Heather McCain is the Executive Director of Creating Accessible Neighborhoods, a nonprofit they founded in 2005, delivering workshops and amplifying projects and events across Turtle Island or North America. Heather's own experiences with multiple types of disabilities, neurodivergence, inaccessibility, and ableism led them to become a well-known and respected advocate, speaker, educator, and activist. Heather works to create equity, celebrate diversity, and educate people on the need to implement accessibility. Thanks for being here, Heather.
Thank you for having me.
Do you want to give some opening remarks?
Sure. So I really come from the community perspective and online access, which includes social media, gaming, and other online pastimes, is a bridge for people with disabilities. It's a way to find community, share their voice, tackle isolation, help with mental health, find support, and even for some, find their diagnosis. And it's really important that there is that reliable internet that is affordable. And for a lot of our members, they can't afford the internet because they're on disability. Personally, I, up until 2 months ago, have been using my neighbor's internet for 7 years because I'm on disability as well, and have been unable to afford internet myself. And this is the problem, is we have so many people who can't afford internet, and then those that have geographical inaccessibility because of where they are when they can't afford the internet. It's so slow or it lags that it really affects their ability to access all that they need to. And as was said, the pandemic has certainly highlighted the inequities of digital access. And one thing that I think of is, there's a quote by Jimo Alua who said, "We should not have a society where the value of marginalized people is determined by how well they can scale often impossible obstacles that others will never know." And I think that's really important, because the access to programs that are available, the access to internet access is very limited and is very hard, and a lot of marginalized people already have a lot of labor expected of them. And having to access these programs that they don't even know about is a huge issue. So we really need to improve the ability to be able to do that. I think also we really have to look at how the unequal access perpetuates the poverty for those with disabilities and their families, and how every person in Canada should have basic internet service available to them moving forward.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And we're excited to dig into that more. So we'll move to Jess. Jess Mitchell is the Senior Manager for Research and Design at the Inclusive Design Research Center at OCAD University in Toronto. Jess values a critical perspective and appreciates the messy parts of human interaction. She also comes to our discussion today on the value of inclusivity with a background in ethics studies. Welcome, Jess.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'll just jump in here. The sort of angle that I am coming from in this is, as the minister aptly commented, so little of this is about technology. Maybe I'm overemphasizing what the minister said, but I think so little of this is about technology. We have the ability to make technologies available and to spread internet, as Heather said, as a basic human need. There's a lot of talk about it being like a utility. As more and more of our lives depend on having access, this shows the greater disparities. And this is not, as the framing of this has emphasized, a rural-urban issue. This is intersectional. And it should be on all of us to ask who doesn't have access and why. And in the asking of that, we need to move beyond any kinds of taxonomies of fill in the blank identification, and rather get access for people. Just to illustrate this, I used to live in a slightly rural area. I'm not even sure we would call this a rural area. It's on the outskirts of Hamilton, and I had internet issues. Now I'm in a position where I have enormous privilege, so being able to participate was something that was within my reach, but it required 2 internet service providers, not 1, because you had to have a backup. I have colleagues who have the same experience, that if they are going to be able to collaborate on a parity with us, they're going to have more than 1 service available to them, and that's usually at great cost. As Heather said, affording 1 internet service provider is prohibitive. Imagine 2. So I think that I'm interested in this from the ethics perspective, from the intersectional perspective. When we scratch the surface of technology problems, more often than not, they get to social justice issues. So glad to be here.
Awesome. Thanks so much. All right, next up is David Lepofsky, who is a visiting professor of disability rights and legal education at the Osgoode Hall Law School and a past adjunct member of the University of Toronto's Faculty of Law. He holds volunteer leadership positions in the disability community and is the chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance. David's publications have been cited in several decisions of the Supreme Court of Canada, as well as by trial and appeal courts across Canada. Thanks for being here, David.
Great to be here, everyone, and great to get a chance to talk to such excellent panelists, with such excellent panelists. here are the headlines. Number one, as a blind person, I have and continue to face endless, ridiculous accessibility barriers when it comes to information technology and access to information. This is a sector of our lives that is the easiest one to ensure accessibility. There are others that are harder, like the built environment. Some buildings are old, they need a lot of fixes. But the IT sector is one where if we set our mind to it now, then within 3 to 5 years, it should be 100% fully accessible. But that only happens when you have governments that don't just make nice statements, but implement, enforce the actions we need. They don't. And I'm heartened by what the minister said in terms of the goals, but I am going to be offering doable, affordable, productive, concrete measures that could be implemented federally and quite quickly, and that could make a huge difference. The last thing I want to say in my opening is that we live in a country that is behind some other countries in this. We are not in any way a leader in this area when it comes to achieving digital accessibility or even implementing regulations to achieve digital accessibility. We've had a couple of high spots, but they were like a decade ago and technology has surpassed them. But we do have a society where those who are creating and distributing digital information, I suspect overwhelmingly don't even know what digital accessibility for people with disabilities mean. When they hear about accessibility, they hear what some of my other speakers have talked about, things like access to broadband. They wouldn't have the slightest idea that when you send me a PDF, you're taking a document that I likely overwhelmingly can't read, or and in fact, you probably created it in a format that would have been 100% accessible and converted it to PDF, thereby destroying the accessibility that you unknowingly created when you first created the document. So there are ways in which we could quickly transform to change this, but we got to understand that we're starting with a world out there that does not know within Canada for the most part about this stuff. The people who create the digital infrastructure don't know, and therefore they are barrier creators, with new generations of barrier creators being created by universities and colleges every year. We got to stop this now, and our government can lead. There's great ways to do it, and stay tuned. I'll tell you how. Back
Awesome.
to you.
Thank you. Looking forward to that. Okay, and our final panelist, Mo Dhaliwal, is the founder and director of strategy at Skyrocket, an agile creative agency where he creates high-level business solutions for a global portfolio of clients and oversees a development team working to create cutting-edge apps and digital experiences. For over 2 decades, Mo has been a tech entrepreneur, strategist, and visionary leader, organizing people into movements that promote inclusivity and shatter cross-cultural barriers. Thanks for being here, Mo.
Thanks for having me. Really looking forward to the conversation today, and I'll touch briefly on my intersection with this topic. So Skyrocket Digital was formed 9 years ago, but before that, I had a lot of cultural interests in the city of Vancouver, right? Recognizing that we are a diverse community and in a diverse region of Canada, but not an inclusive one. And so my cultural interests were largely on trying to find a sense of belonging for myself, and then hopefully through that for others. And when we actually started Skyrocket, a couple of interesting things to note. I definitely came into it with a perspective of wanting to build things, right? In a creative agency that is active in web development, that's a big part of why you have a passion in this area. And I'm not sure how many people remember these headlines, but I remember reading about, for example, the automated soap dispenser that couldn't recognize Black people, or the very famous moment when a Google image recognition algorithm recognized a Black person as a gorilla, and something for which they had to then later on come out and apologize for. And so my interest and understanding of inclusion was always from a racial and sort of cultural perspective, and wanting to bring equity and justice through that lens. But as we started, building more and more for the internet, what became apparent was that there was a need for accessibility, but a real lack of it in everything that we did and everything that we built. And even myself, for all of my interest in inclusion and equity and justice, it was an area that I had completely left out of our practice for years, right? And it wasn't actually until one of our American clients, was engaged in a lawsuit where they actually had to, and they're a large consumer brand, and they actually had to defend themselves for having a massive web property that was entirely inaccessible. So it wasn't until litigation that we were pulled in and asked to recommend or provide solutions for this. And then for a short period of time, there was sort of like a fear and a flurry of activity around neighboring brands to want to suddenly bring in accessibility, more as a means of not getting sued than to really think about what inclusion means and what it means to actually bring more people into the fold of this conversation. And so for the last few years, I'd say we've been developing a more accessible web. But as technology evolves and as our tool sets become increasingly frictionless, whatever that upstream bias is that exists, that allowed the automated soap dispenser to get built without being able to recognize a certain type of humanity, that bias exists in our tool sets as well. So it's easier and faster than ever before to deploy incredibly visually impactful and beautiful experiences for the web for people that have a particular set of abilities. But as that momentum is increasing, those biases are also being amplified exponentially, right? And that's what David touched on as well. And so companies like ours are really left to their own devices to kind of do their best and to behave in a virtuous fashion when it comes to thinking about inclusion or when it comes to things like accessibility. But really, it has to be brought in a mode and a model the same way we've started to address privacy, for example, right? It's a non-starter, in many countries like Canada and Europe, to build websites that don't have privacy and security functions built in, right? It's a non-starter for websites today to not have SSL certificates. And in a similar way, I think we need to actually look at what biases exist, upstream in the platforms and the publishers of content, and address them there, so that when they're building new tool sets and when they're building new platforms and new technologies for us to continue building for the modern web, that those biases are addressed upstream. So I'm really going to be coming to this conversation with a perspective of somebody that is trying to build for the modern web and trying to do it in an inclusive way. But I can tell you with some amount of shame that where I live and work in Vancouver, you could throw a rock and hit probably 20 digital agencies within a 5-block radius, and I very much doubt that even a minority of them have a strong focus on accessibility features when they're building for the modern web.
Awesome, thank you, and thanks to all of the panelists for staying on time. Not always an easy feat. And I will say too, there's already a question in the chat about how we train digital providers and engineers around this stuff. So Mo, I think we'll come back to you on that in time. So just a few notes. We are using Jamboards to collect additional feedback from folks. If you click on the link in the chat, and the sticky note feature, which is the easiest tool to use, is the fourth option on the left, and it looks like a little box with two lines in it. And additionally, if you would like to ask your question verbally, there's just a few too many of us here today to allow the sort of put hands up feature, but we've put a phone number in the chat that you can call, or if you want to put your own phone number in the chat, we can call you to get your question and we'll relay it. That number is 647-960-8022, 647-960-8022. Okay, so we're going to move now to our first guiding question, and that is, what further steps are needed to ensure digital inclusion for people with disabilities in Canada? Some great ideas have already been mentioned, but let's get some more. So further steps needed to achieve digital inclusion. I don't know if somebody wants to start, or I'm happy to call on somebody. Heather, do you mind starting?
It's David. I'm happy to start.
Sure. Okay, David, go ahead.
Okay. Well, let me offer these ideas. Number one, We need a strong mandatory information and communication standard enacted federally. That power was created 2 years ago in the Accessible Canada Act, and yet no such regulation has been created. And we have no, as far as I know, no deadline for when one will be created. The longer the federal government delays that, the more inaccessibility will be created, new barriers will be created, making the situation worse rather than making it better. The second thing is, and the same goes for provincial governments that have accessibility legislation. Ontario has an information communication standard. It was passed in 2011. A report is out recommending that it be strengthened. The government has been dragging their feet on that for months, if not longer. The next thing that we need is the federal government to take concrete, and provincial government to take concrete targeted action right now that could stop the creation of new barriers in certain specified areas. I gave the example before of PDFs. PDFs create accessibility problems. And anybody who tells you that, oh, here's an accessible PDF, I'll tell you, you've been misled. Possibly genuinely, but you've been misled. PDFs are inherently a barrier. That's not to say they should be banned, but rather when a document is posted that's a PDF, there should be an accessible alternative format version of it posted, such as an MS Word document. That doesn't cost anything because those documents aren't written in PDF. They're written in a program like Word. And then which was accessible when written. And then by converting it to PDF, the accessibility is destroyed. Now, there are those who say, oh, but you can then retrofit the PDF. Yeah, you could destroy the accessibility and try to spend a whole lot of time putting it back in, even though when we get a PDF, we'll never know how much of it was really in until we try to open it and navigate it. There are many of us who just say, to hell with it, just don't send me a PDF. But why not just make the accessible version available right away? It doesn't cost anything, it's easy to do. And if we started that immediately as a go forward policy, and then retrofit, for example, federal or provincial government websites with important ones that are current and are critical, then we could make a whole lot of progress right away. The next thing we need to do is we need to ensure that there are accessibility strings attached to government, federal or provincial, payments, loans, grants, transfer payments that are tied to digital infrastructure, so that public money is never again used to create new barriers. Not only shouldn't the federal government be creating new barriers, they should make sure that if they give money, transfer payment money that can be used to create digital infrastructure, that infrastructure must be accessible. We don't do that now. We tried to get an amendment requiring that in the Accessible Canada Act 2 years ago. We didn't get anywhere, unfortunately, despite strong support from the disability community. Then, and this is really important, when people get our money, we want to make sure it's conditioned on the fact that they want to use our money, they got to use it while creating digital infrastructure that is accessible digital infrastructure. And that will actually create all sorts of beneficial ripple effects in the economy, because there are lots of people who want to get their hands on government money, especially for infrastructure and procurement requirements. But until and unless these strings are attached, they don't need to worry about it. In fact, they might think, oh, I better not worry about it. I better not think about that accessibility stuff. It'd be, why do I need to? Now, if the government said, you want our money, this is a condition, a mandatory condition, we'd be getting somewhere. By the way, the federal government has power to pass regulations under the Accessible Canada Act to set requirements for accessibility and procurement. But again, they haven't been set. It's been 2 years since that law was passed, and time is ticking. Let me just give you a couple of other examples. I'm going to give you 2 more examples. I'll punt it over to my colleagues. Any government contract or federal contractor should be required, when they contract for any online or digital product to be created, such as a website or a web app or whatever, they should be required not only to ensure it's accessible, but to remediate it if it is not, at the contractor's expense. So that if they mess up, they got to fix it at their expense. Not we've got to worry about paying them to clean up the mess they created. The final recommendation is this. I talked about new generations of barrier creators. We have a problem, and the problem is this. We are training new generations of people to do computer sciences, to do tech, to do electrical engineering, a whole spectrum of people who could affect this area. And we don't require that their training, and their training is often publicly subsidized through grants to universities and colleges, or if it's provincial community colleges, it's fully provincially funded, apart from tuition. We don't require those schools to include digital accessibility in the training of those new generations of web developers, IT developers, and so on. That means we're using public money to train and graduate new generations of barrier creators. That is absurd. We could make a difference right now by the government where they can. The provincial government, which funds colleges and universities, the federal government, when it does attaching strings to money, it gives money to build buildings and so on to colleges and universities. They can attach strings saying, hey, if we're helping you fund a computer science building, we only want to do that if we're sure that the people who will be trained in that building will be trained on digital accessibility. So we could have a whole new labor supply in this area. I lied. I got one more idea, but it really will be my last until you guys ask me more, and then I'll think of more. This is an area where Canada should have an economic development strategy. There is a demand worldwide for accessible websites, for accessible IT, and so on. In some countries, like the US, where they're legislatively ahead of us, it's important. Israel as well. The EU is looking in this area. New Zealand is working on developing legislation, and so on. There's 1 billion people with disabilities around the world, and there's a whole lot of need for people who know how to design accessible IT, including how to design accessible websites and web applications and mobile apps, as an example. If Canada were, instead of creating new generations of barrier creators, if we made a targeted strategy of trying to develop our IT sector to include expertise in accessible design, we could be marketing that skill around the world to companies who need it. And of course, technology and web development, you don't have to, even during COVID, you don't have to go anywhere to do it, to help somebody with their software. You can be doing it here, and they could be anywhere from India to Africa, to South America, to wherever. But we're not developing that sector of our economy. We are unconsciously, and our government, federal and provincial, should have an economic development strategy that tries to promote that, because we could be promoting a new arm of international trade where we could have a decided advantage. We don't have it now, but we should. Hope those ideas help. Back to you.
Absolutely. Really great. Mo, can I maybe ask you to pick up on the idea of technical training, as our technologist here, about, would that work? What are other approaches to make the technical community, take this seriously?
Yeah, so there's a bit of a reframe, I think, needed around, what the internet and what the web is. It's long since been a utility, and we just haven't recognized it that way, right? We don't treat it as a utility. Governments don't treat it as a utility. It's still treated as some weird private enterprise that just everybody uses and is commonplace. And therefore, we're allowing, so-called open markets to kind of dictate how it operates and how it functions. But in the same way you would treat, any sort of, public works utility, there's no plumber or electrician that's working on any utilities anywhere without a deep level of certification and training. That similar standard hasn't been applied to anything related to the web, right? There's standards that are incentivized for sure, but we have no shortage of, boot camps and code schools that can get you started and teach you just enough to be horribly dangerous on the web, but not enough to be effective and inclusive, right? So I think, reframing everything to do with the internet, and I'm talking about the entire pipeline, like not just, broadband access, but all the way through to the web browser as a utility, and everything that would come out of that reframing, I think that's necessary. The other is to, and David touched on this a lot, is to move past incentivizing to mandating, right? Companies like mine right now, even let's say some of the more progressive code schools are incentivizing the idea of building in accessible ways right now because of the advantage that can be gained in user acquisition and greater adoption and being able to kind of signal the virtue of being accessible. But as we know, that's not enough. So it really needs to be mandated at a government level. And look, we've got tech companies like Google, Facebook, others that are larger than many nations on the planet, and we all know this. So almost on like a nation-to-nation level, we need to actually have the government of Canada talking to these massive channels and these massive platform developers and publishers to lean on them more specifically, right? We've seen what can happen when governments lean on browsers, for example, and say we need a more secure path for data to travel from server to client, and SSL became ubiquitous, right? We've seen what happens when governments say we need a more transparency in our privacy and in how cookies are managed, right, with GDPR and what have you. And when something becomes mandatory, it isn't seen as a friction anymore. It just becomes commonplace, and companies like mine and the schools react to that and start living in the new reality. And that reframe is actually, I think, what's missing here, is that it's not treated as a mandate; it's treated as a incentive for companies and for these training schools to adopt on their own sort of schedule. And this kind of I'm thinking about what Minister Joyce Murray kind of started off with in the beginning of what the government of Canada is doing to modernize its own systems and to kind of create more seamless access. A lot of that we're really talking about user experience, because as we know, the Canadian government's web systems are high friction and difficult to use, even for people that don't have any visual issues or issues using common web tools, and that's because none of even their systems have been mandated from the ground up to be built using these standards. So I think if the first thing we did was actually bring about some sort of certification or training, and this is to David's point as well of like expressing some leadership here, is that if we've really got an interest in creating inclusion, then there can and should be some level of certification and accreditation for anybody that is building for the web, right? That's the starting point, and I think that's the first step, and not even an inclusion, right? Almost like harm reduction, at the first stage, and then the later stages can be to actually mandate these accessibility protocols for anybody that is then relying on these trained and certified people to build for the web.
Awesome. Okay, thank you.
Jim, can I jump in here?
Yeah, please.
I'm accumulating at least two big things that I disagree with. I think we should be very wary, Mo, all due respect, certifications have been a nightmare. And what has happened is because people, and this is to use your metaphor, because people have dropped the ball upstream, they create industries to try to make things better. And this is the problem. We're too, what is it? The horse is out of the barn already. We have the ability, and I would argue also, Sam, we're all technologists. David's a technologist, Heather's a technologist. The horse is out of the barn already. So we created open standards on the web. You can do your development, you can do your design in all open platforms. You can do co-design. You can have people there from the very beginning. That is not our issue. Our issue is that, as David was saying, this is the horizontal problem or the horizontal thread that affects every single vertical. So when the question is, what are the recommendations? If you're wondering, is this done through government regulation? Is it addressed in education? Do we have to consider it a social justice issue? The answer to all of those is yes. You have to fix all of these things. It's not going to be fixed by a certification that somebody studies for and then gets certified, and now you've created an industry where people are dependent upon a certified person to do this. So yeah, you have to change education, and it has to happen well beyond your computer science programs. If you're just training computer science students in this, we're going to fail. As you said, Mo, most of this is about user experience. Those are not computer science students. So I'm teaching My colleagues are teaching. The Inclusive Design Research Center has a master's in inclusive design. We are teaching people who are in any industry, again, because the vertical, it doesn't matter. There is something relevant to every industry in taking an inclusive design approach. We decided long ago when the internet started not to make these things accessible. You take a look at old Yahoo. There's the what's new and what's cool at the top, what's sexy up here, and then the what's accessible at the very bottom. And back in those days, the what was accessible was literally a mirror web page that was text only, and it would fall out of sync with the original one. I mean, these are the dark ages of the internet, right? Back when we thought that we could enumerate every single web page into some sort of taxonomy on a Yahoo search engine. But at that point, we decided that these two cannot be the same, and that is a farce. It has always been a farce. It should have been the same. Open standards like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, you can build websites, web applications, all of the things that you're building on the web with these open standards, and you can make it accessible, and the training is out there. The issue is within that industry, it has to be, you're not doing good design unless you're doing inclusive design and accessible design. It's no longer a luxury. It should be a requirement. So is it a hammer, or is it, is it the carrot or the stick? It's both. We have to teach people in all departments, not just computer science departments, about ethics, about the unintended consequences of some of the things that they're doing and how they impact everyone's life, including their own. So I'm teaching students at my institution who are coming from business schools, who are coming from the economics department, who are English majors. These are the people who are going out and filling roles in marketing. They're going into banking. And if those people can go into those places and say, hey, wait a minute, I know we can do this slightly differently. Why don't we? Then we have this sort of full-scale approach to having a big impact rather than somebody with a certification has to do this work. And we see the industry that has been created to give that check mark. But we know that the check mark isn't enough either. So the WCAG guidelines are sometimes referred to as standards. They're not standards, they're guidelines. And as the minister said, it's now couth to say we go well beyond WCAG. Well, we've learned that. Accessibility Standards Canada, we're working on a number of grants with, one about the future of work. The future of work is, look at us all, we're working from home. We're working from wherever we want to be, as David said. We put up barriers and said we couldn't break them down, but we know that's not true. So how many public servants were told they couldn't work from home, and then as soon as the pandemic hit, they had to work from home, and they've been working from home for a year? How many people with disabilities were told they couldn't have the job because if they needed to work from home, that wasn't something that could be supported? We've seen in the last year, I think, something we can't unsee, or I hope we don't unsee, which is these arbitrary decisions are ethical decisions. They have an impact, and they are impacting people, and we should question the reason and rationality of making those decisions, all the way from procurement to job descriptions and the way jobs are written, to who gets employed and what they get employed to do, what's their understanding of what they can do within the organization, what kind of supports are there. This isn't hire people with a disability as an extra program. This is people should be in this workspace, and that group of people should be a diverse set of people, because we know diverse teams do better. They come up with better solutions. So if we had that upstream when we started making decisions about digital government, and we started making decisions about internet as a utility, where would we be today versus where are we now? I think that those are the...
I just want to clarify. I would never advocate for not doing what you're talking about. I think the certification for me, really kind of seemed like a solution, because we've been at a loss ourselves of like, where do we hire from, right? Even on the web development side of, because we're screening for experience constantly, and there's this sort of idea of incentivizing the work. And understanding that society will be better if it's baked into every aspect of education all around us, absolutely. But then there's the aspect of what can you just mandate, Like, what could we mandate tomorrow, right? And to your point of, you know, how COVID changed everything, is like, we've just lacked the imagination to this point. But I feel like we could have the imagination to mandate a new way of being, and sure enough, the world, our country, would react, and there'd be a new normal, right? So
No,
I'm
we
interested.
agree.
Mhm.
Yeah, and
Heather,
I think it's a balance of mandate and also opportunity, right? So mandate alone is not going to do it, but yes.
Heather, I want to make sure you can get in on this question. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to move away from the tech part of it and talk about the fact that, well, the government talks about addressing the issues that affect disabled people. They're not talking about educating themselves about the inherent ableism that is part of government, society, practices, and programs. And unless that is addressed, we're not going to move forward. We also need to talk about how, as Jess mentioned, this is a social justice issue. In order to disrupt the bias and inequities of the digital divide and understand how intersecting identities like poverty, gender, race impact people's ability to digitally access the world. You know, we've had members that were forced to quit school because they did not have access, and they've seen that access become available when non-disabled people needed it during the pandemic. And they're already being told by their schools that it's going to disappear post-pandemic. And, you know, I think this speaks to the inherent ableism within the institutions that constantly affect people with disabilities. And really, it's the, you know, the oppression that we experience. And this is where it's hard for disabled people to trust that the government and these institutions will actually do what's right for disabled people and integrate accessibility, because they have been fighting against it for so long. And that's where I do agree that we need to have more definitive policies, including within the Accessible Canada Act, that stipulate that you know, digital accessibility has to be done, because these institutions are not going to do it on their own. They're not going to do it for the good of disabled people or for the good of society. We've already been fighting these institutions, and we have a member who took a course on website design, and there was no mention of accessibility within that whatsoever. And when they brought it up, they were told that they should create a presentation to give to the class for free. And this is another problem, is there's a lot of expectation of labor, energy, and time from disabled people without proper compensation, financial compensation, which perpetuates the poverty that we live in. Now they happen to run a company called Humanized Consulting, and so they've created their own workshop, which they're doing. But this is the problem, is all too often it's people that are, you know, in these classes having to interact with ableist systems and having to fight for access on a class by class basis, whereas we need this to come from the government in order to really have that. You know, I do think that we've been using the carrot approach, to use what Jess was talking about. We've been using the carrot approach. It's time for the hammer. The carrot has not worked. And we need something that has teeth. We need something that recognizes that the inherent ableism is not going to move this forward. And we can't just address the technical side of it. We have to address the ableist side of it and how that's affecting every decision that's made. And even honestly, who gets hired from the disabled population. So it's great that they are talking about hiring people, but often what's happening is they hire people who have privileges, which give a different experience of life. And so we want to really make sure that they're hiring a cross section of people with disabilities to bring in not only those technical skills, but that lived experience of understanding what barriers there are in communities within intersecting identities, and better understand how to address these issues from, you know, the multiple prongs of which it's affecting people.
Awesome. Okay, so much to unpack there, but conscious of time, I do want to move to our second question. And for those who are contributing on the Jamboards, which are jamming, if I can, thank you. And if you want to move to the second slide, you do so at the top. There's a set of arrows, and you can just move to the right to move to the next slide. And I do want to acknowledge some of the most popular ideas, you know, in the chat and on the Jamboards that we didn't get a chance to speak to. The idea of subsidized internet costs through social or disability assistance programs, probably being the top. But I just want to pick up on Heather, what you just said about enforcement, which is really our second theme, which is, so we can create rules, we can create mandates, but what are the sticks? What is working in enforcement and what is not currently, because it's not as if there are no rules whatsoever right now. And so how can governments better enforce digital accessibility is the question. Does somebody clamoring to start?
Just because I was speaking to the idea of mandating before, I'll start here just maybe with a general theme. And maybe the idea isn't to even look at it as like the stick necessarily, but just as like a passive new high watermark for what web standards are in Canada, right? I think, you know, we need that to come in with policy first, and then allow the market to react to that. Right, and then the market can react to it in all sorts of ways. I mean, who knows? It might be, you know, some Google algorithm that just, you know, does it for you and everything is perfect from now on. Who knows? But I think there has to be at least raising the high water mark as policy as a starting point.
Anybody else on this?
Not to derail things, I agree with everything David Lepofsky says. Just flat out. And he's got very, very strong things to say about the Accessibility Act, very strong things to say about the AODA refresh. Those things should be paid attention to, and he went through those very quickly. But I also want to say that, to Heather's point, I think that we're oversimplifying to the point of not making it work for really anybody. Because if we take, again, the lessons of the last year, we take a look, this isn't about technology. This is about who gets access and who doesn't. And it's not just internet access, it's who is caring for a young child who doesn't know the QWERTY keyboard and is taking, you know, first grade from home and has to work full time and does not have time off and does not have access to a vaccination. It is all of these moments that earmark for us the marginalized, the doubly marginalized, the triply marginalized and beyond. And if you take a look at any of these questions, like how are we going to make the web more accessible? How are we going to make the future of work more accessible? It becomes, first we've got to understand the complexities of who we are and how we live. And the strange things that we've taken for granted, like we should all go back to the office. Is that desirable? Is that inclusive? Is that something that's going to help with the digital divide? So I think that we have an opportunity here. And I worry that we're going to squander our opportunity because we're going to go back to what we considered normal, but we knew with normal, people didn't have access. People still weren't getting included. People still weren't becoming part of the workforce, or were underemployed or unemployed. And I think that Heather's point about, you know, these are upstream, and Mo's point about these being upstream problems, we have to address ableism, we have to address access, the socioeconomic factors, like this is intersectional. This is complex, and if we shy away from the complexity of it and think that regulation alone is going to help, then I think we're missing some pieces. But I do think that very strong, toothy acts and regulations, they never harm. Well, they won't harm.
And actually, like the thing that I find a little heartbreaking about this conversation is that just the irony of it all to some extent, because I mean, the potential of digital is actually to meet a diversity of millions of people where they are, right? But we're not engineered for that, because there's been a flattening of, you know, the entire experience, and that flattening, I think, is where the imagination is necessary to actually bring diversity into like interface, bring diversity into experience, and it's happened, right? We've seen it happen with, you know, the number of, you know, devices. Just to kind of simplify the metaphor for a second, like as the diversity of devices exploded, we saw some level of standardization, but also a lot of standards that were able to like bend and flex and show up, you know, in very, very different ways. So I think, you know, we need some imagination right now on actually leveraging technology to meet people where they are.
David, can I call on you just to pick up what Jess was mentioning about the AODA and other acts?
Well, let me tell you a couple things. And I in turn agree with everything Jess says, just so you know, there's total parity. what did she say? I'm joking. There are two things. First, on enforcement, it is axiomatic that people are far more likely to comply with the law if the law is effectively enforced and if they expect it to be. In Ontario, they do not expect the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act to be effectively enforced because it hasn't been for a decade. Fines are paltry and rare. They don't inspect on site. They do paper assessments or inspections. It's farcical. And to the extent that effective enforcement is provided, and the federal minister responsible for the Accessible to Canada Act, Carla Qualtrough, echoed this concern that there's got to be effective enforcement. Unfortunately, we're not seeing it federally because there's nothing to enforce in terms of accessibility standards because they haven't passed them. And there's no end in sight. So this is very worrisome. The second thing is, even in the absence of, and until effective enforcement is established, what we do know is that government has a lever of power that is an enormously powerful one, but largely goes unused. I adverted to it before, and that is the power of the purse. Federal and provincial governments spend billions each year on procurement and on infrastructure. If they add accessibility strings to those grants and loans and contracts, including digital accessibility strings, they have the good fortune that they can do it tomorrow. They have the good fortune that the enforcement lever they've got is, unless you make the commitments, we're not giving you our money, and there's lots of other people who want it. They have the fortune, the good fortune, that this gets around any complaint about, well, are you imposing too many regulations and blah, 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 because this is for people who opt in to get federal money for transfer payments and so on. The reality is, when it's done, it can make a huge difference. The other thing that we know is that the IT sector is one where change is so much more easily achievable. Like I said before, and I want to expand on this, we have a built environment that is overwhelmingly full of barriers facing people with mobility, sensory, and other disabilities. And as in digital accessibility, we have inadequate regulations to set requirements. And as in the case of digital accessibility, those who design the built environment, architects, landscape engineers, and so on, aren't required to be trained on accessibility. So they are publicly financed new generations of barrier creators are being created at the same time. It's the same thing. The difference is that the turnover in physical built environment in the next 5 years is going to be limited. Most of the buildings that are out there today will be still out there in 5 years and 10 years and so on. Some new ones will be built, but overwhelmingly the old ones will still be there with the same barriers. But on the other hand, when it comes to IT, the technology that we will be using in 5 years, the mobile technology, the digital technology, the desktop technology, the websites, they haven't been bought, they haven't been paid for, they haven't even been designed yet. And the stuff we're using now is virtually all going to be completely out of date. So there's this enormous turnover. And not only that, but IT is, and digital technology is entirely driven by innovation. That is to say, you look at what we use now compared to what we used 10 years ago, and it's laughable what we used to use. What used to 20 years ago, it's like, it's quaint. It's like looking at a horse and buggy compared to the modern car. Well, that's where we're going to be in 5 or 10 years again, in an industry where innovation is the driving force. And therefore, in an industry where there's huge turnover, where building and accessibility is not a costly thing, where there is that kind of innovation and turnover all happening, this is the easiest environment of any in the economy to make change. The way we make sure it doesn't happen is keep giving out that public money without digital accessibility strings, not enacting binding regulations that stipulate exactly what to do, and not attaching funding and regulatory requirements to ensure those who design digital products must know accessibility, and not enforcing whatever there is on the books. Those 4 ingredients, which are all in place right now, are a guarantee that we won't get where we want to go. So it's easy to get there. We know what to do. We're not doing it. What are we waiting for? Back to you.
All right, thank you. Just with our closing minutes, I want to turn it to Heather. Heather, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, one of the things that I think the government needs to do is to stop fracturing the access to programs that are for internet. So for example, connecting families is for low-income families, but it doesn't include seniors or single people. Then we have, like in BC, the TELUS Internet for Good, which is for people on provincial disability or federal disability, but we have low-income disabled people who don't have access to it. So what we need is that access to stop being fractured into if you fit into this certain demographic, and if you know that this program exists, so that you can then apply, and if it's accessible enough for you to be able to apply, and if you qualify with the qualifications, then you get it. We need to have access that is, first of all, has less strings attached to it, is out there so that everybody knows. I mean, the ministry sends out our stubs every month to people on disability. There should be something that says what these programs are in order to make sure that everybody is understanding what it is. But yeah, I think it's really important that funding be attached to what the government does moving forward, and making sure that low income people, period, no matter what demographic you're in, are getting that support to have the internet. I also think there needs to be better funding for libraries, because the one thing that the pandemic has highlighted too is how much digital literacy comes from libraries. And with the libraries being closed, there are a lot of older adults and a lot of people with English as an additional language and other barriers who do not have access to digital literacy right now. And in a time when digital literacy is needed because of how much is online, that's really kind of, even duplicated the inequities that are already there. So those are 2 things that I would really like to see is, having better access to low-income people for access internet without having it be fractured into certain demographics, or that awareness of the programs. But also, yeah, really, let's help the libraries. I know here in Vancouver, for example, our librarians are doubling as social workers because we have people who need to use government programs who can't do the applications themselves, who don't understand how to use the websites. The websites don't have accessibility. And so these librarians are using a lot of their time in order to help with these forms. And because of the pandemic, that access has been cut off as well. And so there's people who need disability who are not getting disability. And so these are the barriers that we really need to look at. And there are already community solutions to it, but they're not properly being supported.
An amazing way to wrap. We really just scratched the surface of this, but we're going to wrap it here. The Jamboard will continue to be open and accessible to all who want to add to it, and we will be making the recording available of this discussion, along with a transcript and a shorter summary of the major takeaways in the coming days. And I'd be remiss if I didn't pick up on the library comment. Our next session in this 6-part series is focused on public internet access and the role of municipalities and libraries. And we have some great leaders from across the country joining us. That's in 2 weeks at the same time. So on Wednesday, June 2nd at 12 p.m. Eastern, 9 Pacific. And you can register using the link in the chat that we are about to add. And we hope to see you there. Thank you to everyone for joining us. I learned a lot. I'm I'm sure our listeners did as well. And we want to keep the participation going. We will also, I should say, at the end of this 6-part, be preparing a report of everything that we heard about how we can really close the digital divide coming out of the pandemic in Canada. So many thanks to the panelists, thanks to the minister for being here, thanks to Shannon and Jocelyn for the ASL interpretation today, and thanks everyone for
can I make
participating.
A quick plug?
Yes,
Just a
please.
quick plug. Follow me on Twitter at David Lepofsky, DavidLepofsky. We're very active on these issues at David Lepofsky. And also sign up to get our email updates if you want to learn more about this. AODAalliance.org, AODAalliance.org. If you go there, there's a link to sign up to get our email updates. Thanks a lot.
Amazing. And we'll include that too in the email that we send out to everyone. We'll also be sending a survey for your feedback. So thanks very much, everyone. And we hope you have a great afternoon. Take care.